Hello, Lena. Part 2.
Part 2. On the table, in the light of a big lamp with a red shade, he spread a piece of parchment rather like a map. This was made by Thorir, your grandfather, Thorin, he said in an answer to the dwarves' excited questions. It is a plan of the mountain. I don't see that this will help us much, said Thorin disappointedly after a glance. I remember the mountain well enough and the lands about it, and I know where the Mirkwood is and the withered heath where the great dragons bred. There is a dragon marked in red on the mountain, said Balin, but it will be easy enough to find him without that if we ever even arrive there. There is one point you haven't noticed, said the wizard, and it is a secret entrance. You see that rune on the west side, and the hand pointing to it from the other runes? That marks a hidden passage to the lower halls. Look at the map at the beginning of this book, and you will see that there are runes in red. It may have been secret once, said Thorin, but how do we know that it's a secret any longer? Old Smog has lived down there long enough now to find out anything is there to find out that there to find out anything there is to know about those caves. He may, but he can't have used it for years and years and years. Why? Because it's too small. 5 feet high and the door 5 feet high the door, and 3 may walk abreast, said the runes. But Smog could not creep into a hole that size, not even when he was a young dragon, certainly not after devouring so many of the dwarves he met and men of Dale. It seems a big hole to me, squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons, and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again, so that he forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and in his hall there hung a large one of the county road with all of his favorite walks marked on it in red ink. How could such a large door be kept a secret from anybody outside, apart from the dragon, he asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember. In lots of ways, said Gandalf, but in what way this one has been hidden we don't know without going to see. From what it says on the map, I should guess there is a closed door, which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarves' method, I think that is, isn't it? Quite right, said Thorin. Also, went on Gandalf, I forgot to mention that with the map went a key, a small and curious key. Here it is, he said, and handed it to Thorin, a key with a long barrel and intricate words made of silver. Keep it safe. Indeed I will, said Thorin, and he fastened it upon a fine chain that hung about his neck and under his jacket. Now things begin to look more hopeful. This news alters them much for the better. So far, we have had no clear idea what to do. We thought of going east, as quiet and careful as we could, as far along the lake. After that, the trouble would begin. A long time before that, if I know anything about the roads east, interrupted Gandalf. We must go from there up along the river runnings, went on Thorin, taking no notice. And so to the ruins of Dale, the old town in the valley there, under the shadow of the mountain. But none of us liked the idea of the front gate. The river runs right out of it through the great cliff at the south of the mountain, and out of it comes the dragon too. Far too often, unless he has changed his habits. That would be no good, said the wizard, not without a mighty warrior, even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and this neighborhood heroes are scarce, or simply not to be found. Swords in the parts are mostly blunt, and axes used for trees and shields as cradles or dish covers. And dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. This is why I settled on burglary, except when I remembered the existence of a side door. And here is our little Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, the chosen and selected burglar. So now let's get on and make some plans. Very well then, said Thorin. Supposing the burglar expert gives us some ideas or suggestions. He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo. First, I should like to know a bit more about things, said he, feeling feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far tookishly determined to go on with things. I mean about the gold and the dragons and all that, and how it got there, and who it belongs to, and so on and further. Bless me, said Thorin. Haven't you got a map, and didn't you hear our song, and haven't we been talking about all this for hours? All the same, I should like it all plain and clear, he said, obstinately, putting on his business manner usually reserved for people who tried to borrow money off of him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional and live up to Gandalf's recommendation. Also, I should like to know about the risks, out-of-pocket expenses, time required, and remuneration and so forth. By which he meant, what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to come back alive? Oh well, said Thorin. Long ago in my grandfather Thor's time, our family was driven out of the far north and came back with all their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had only been discovered by my far ancestor Thrain the Old, but now they mined and tunneled and made huger halls and greater workshops, and in addition, I believe they found a great deal of gold and great many jewels too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous, and my grandfather was king under the mountain again, and treated with great reverence by the mortal men who lived in the south, and were gradually spreading up the running river, as far as the valley overshadowed by the mountain. They built the merry town of Dale there in those days. Kings used to send for our smiths and reward even the least skillfully most richly.
Fathers would beg us to take their sons as apprentices and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies, which we never bothered to grow or find for ourselves. Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak of the most marvelous and magical toys, the like of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armor and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north. Undoubtedly, that was what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. There were lots of dragons in the north in those days, and gold was probably getting scarce up there, with the dwarves flying south or getting killed, and all the general waste and destruction that dragons make from going from bad to worse. There was a most specially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smog. One day he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north, and the pine trees on the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind. Some of the dwarves who happened to be outside, I was one luckily, a fine adventurous lad in those days, always wandering about, and it saved my life that day. Well, from a good way off, we saw the dragon settle on our mountain in a spout of flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the woods, they all went up in fire. By that time, all the bells were ringing in Dale, and the warriors were arming. The dwarves rushed out of their great gate, but there was the dragon waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in a steam, and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors. The usual unhappy story. It was only too common in those days. Then he went back and crept in through the front gate and routed out all the halls and lanes and tunnels, alleys, cellars, mansions, and passages. After that, there were no dwarves left alive inside, and he took all their wealth for himself. Probably, for that is the dragon's way, he has piled it all up in a great heap far inside, and sleeps on it for a bed. Later he used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale was ruined, and all the people dead or gone. What goes on there now I don't know for certain, but I don't suppose anyone lives nearer to the mountain than the far ledge of the long lake nowadays. A few of us that were well outside sat and wept in hiding and cursed Smog, and there we were unexpectedly joined by my father and grandfather with singed beards. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When I asked how they had got away, they told me to hold my tongue, and said that one day in the proper time I should know. After that we went away, and we have had to earn our livings as best we could up and down the lands, often enough sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we've never forgotten our stolen treasure, and even now, when I will allow we have a good bit laid by and are not so badly off, here Thorin stroked the gold chain around his neck, we still mean to get it back, and to bring our curses home to Smaug, if we can. I have often wondered about my father's and my grandfather's escape. I see now they must have had private side door, which only they knew about. But apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got hold of it, and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. I did not get hold of it, I was given it, said the wizard. Your grandfather Thror was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin? Curse his name, yes, said Thorin. And Thrain, your father, went away on the 21st of April, 100 years ago, last Thursday, and has never been seen by you since? True, true, said Thorin. Well, your father gave me this to give to you, and if I have chosen my own time and way for handing it over, you can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I had to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when he gave me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I think I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is, he said, handing the map to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would have liked to say the same. The explanation did not seem to explain. Your grandfather, said the wizard slowly and grimly, gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures of a most unpleasant sort he had, but he never got near the mountain. How he got there I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the Necromancer. Whatever were you doing there? Asked Thorin, with a shudder, and all the dwarves shivered. Never you mind, I was finding things out as usual, and a nasty dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorin. We must give a thought to the Necromancer. Don't be absurd. He is an enemy far beyond the powers of all the dwarves put together. If they could all be collected again from the four corners of the world. The one thing your father wished was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragon and the mountain are more than enough. Big enough tasks for you. Hear, hear, said Bilbo, and accidentally said it aloud. Hear what? They all said, turning suddenly towards him. And he was so flustered that he answered, Hear what I have got to say. What's that? They asked. Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look round. After all, there is the side door, and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And well, don't you know, I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed, and an early start and all that? I will give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. Aren't you the burglar, and isn't sitting on the doorstep your job? Not to speak of getting inside the door. But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham when starting on a journey, fried, not poached, and mind you, don't break 'em. After all the others had ordered their breakfasts, without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had to find room for them all, and filled all his spare rooms and made beds on chairs and sofas before he got them all stowed and went to his own little bed very tired and not altogether happy. One thing he did make his mind up was not to bother to get up very early and cook everybody else's wretched breakfast. The tookishness was wearing off, and he was now not quite sure that he was going to go on any journey in the morning. As he lay in bed, he could hear Thorin still humming to himself in the best bedroom next to him. Far over the misty mountains cold, to the dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break a day to find our long-forgotten gold. Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up.
Chapter 2, Roast Mutton. Up jumped Bilbo and putting on his dressing gown went into the dining room. There he saw nobody but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room and piles of unwashed crooks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved, after all, to think that they had gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up, but with never a thank you, he thought, and yet, in a way, he could not help but feeling a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, "thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? And what about an early start? And here you are, having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you a message because they could not wait." "What message?" said poor Mr. Baggins in all the fluster. "Great elephant," said Gandalf, "you are not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." "What's that got to do with it? I have had enough to do with washing up to 14. "If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found a note just under this clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. This is what it said: "Thorin and Company to Burglar Bilbo greeting. For your hospitality, our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. Terms: cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or by our representatives if occasion arises, and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations, and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp. Trusting that you will be punctual, we have the honor to remain, yours deeply, Thorin and Co." "That leaves you just 10 minutes. You will have to run," said Gandalf. "But," said Bilbo. "No time for it," said the wizard. "But," said Bilbo again. "No time for that either. Off you go." To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, a walking stick, or any money or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a mile more. Very puffed he was, and when he got to the Bywater just on the stroke of 11 and found he had come without a pocket handkerchief. "Bravo," said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came around the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies. Each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo. "Up you two get, and off we go," said Thorin. "I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I have come without my hat, and I've left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until 10:45 to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many of other things before you get to this journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage." That's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except of course when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but he still began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first, they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country, inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or farmer ambling on by business. They then came to the lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were the dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles, with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed so gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Most of it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales. But now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands, they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. To think that it will soon be June, grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time, it was pouring with rain, and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, the pony was tired and stumbled on stones, the others were too grumpy to talk. I'm sure the rain has got into the dry clothes and into the food bags, thought Bilbo. Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was home in my nice hole by the fire, with the kettle just beginning to sing. It was not the last time that he had wished that. Since the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit, somewhere behind the dark gray clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down into the deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up and willows along its banks bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with the rains, came crushing down from the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed over. The wind broke up the gray clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper, and when shall we get a dry patch to sleep on?
Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten meat, talked most, and laughed most, but now he simply was not there at all. Just when a wizard would have been most useful too, groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbits' views about regular meals, plenty and often. They decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere, out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Owen and Glowin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright at nothing and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Feely and Keely were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off of him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper, and less for breakfast. There they all sat, glum and wet and muttering, while Owen and Glowin went on trying to light the fire and quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures were not all pony rides in May sunshine when Balin, who was always their look-out man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could go and see, and anything was better than a little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. Others said, "These parts are none too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom even heard of the king round here, and the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find." Some said, "After all, there are 14 of us." Others said, "Where has Gandalf got to go?" Or got to. This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Owen and Glowin began to fight. That settled it. "After all, we have got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could, they made a good deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dreading as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very brightly through the tree trunks not far ahead. Now it is the burglar's turn, they said, meaning Bilbo. You must go on and find out all about that light, and what it is for, and if all is perfectly safe and canny, said Thorin to the hobbit. Now scuttle off and come back quick, if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl, and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can. Off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he could not hoot, even once, like any kind of owl, any more than a fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in the woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone, and this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting around a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from their great heavy faces on them and their size, and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all. Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow, said one of the trolls. Never a blinking bit of man flesh we have had for long enough, said the second. What the hell William was a-thinking of to bring us to these parts at all, beats me, and the drink's running short, what's more, he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at the jug. William choked. Shut your mouth, he said as soon as he could. You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be et by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way when you'd have said thank you, Bill, for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is. He took a big bite off the sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I am afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only 1 head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try roasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a good bit of quick burglaring. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the troll's pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile, if you can manage it, pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beard, and walked off without their noticing him. Others more practical, but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pocket seemed the least difficult. So at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! Thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this one was no exception. Hey, who are you? It squeaked as it left the pocket. And William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. Blimey, Bert, look what I've copped, said William. What is it? Said the others coming up. Lummy if I knows. What are you? Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. A hobbit, as they said, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake, and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. What's a hobbit got to do with my pocket, anyway, said William. And can you cook 'em, said Tom. You can try, said Bert, picking up a skewer. He wouldn't make above a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper. Not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps they're more like him roundabout, and we might make a pie, said Bert. Here, you. are there any more you're sort of sneaking in these woods here, you nasty little rabbit? Said he, looking at the hobbit's furry feet, and he picked him up by the toes and shook him. Yes, lots, said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. No, none at all, not one, he said immediately afterwards. What do you mean? Said Bert, holding him right way up by the hair this time. What I say, said Bilbo, gasping. And please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper. Poor little blighter, said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold, also he had had lots of beer. Poor little blighter, let him go. Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all, said Bert. I don't want to have me throat cut in me sleep, hold his toes on the fire till he talks. I won't have it, said William. I caught him anyway. You're a fat fool, William, said Bert, as I've said before this evening, and you're a lout. And I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins, says Bert, and he puts his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly onto the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round, so he just lay there for a while, panting, just outside the circle of firelight.